Welcome everyone to the Business of Saving Our Planet speaker series. This is the second of 4 moderated panel discussions co-hosted by Johns Hopkins Environmental Sciences and Policy Program and Heidrick & Struggles, an international executive search firm focused on leadership and culture shaping. My name is Scott Atkinson. I am your very grateful moderator tonight. I'm also a partner at Heidrick & Struggles, where I co-head our sustainability office and lead our global venture capital practice. And I'm also a current graduate student with Johns Hopkins. So spoiler alert as to why we co-hosted this with Hopkins and Heidrick. In partnership with Dr. Jerry Burgess and Dr. Jen DeRosa from Johns Hopkins, the idea of this panel series was to explore some of the most important topics related to environmental leadership and impact, and better understand the challenges and opportunities with a panel of established leaders who are advancing visionary ideas and action in conservation and planetary health. And we are so appreciative to have this amazing group who's traveled from far and wide. Along with our panel, we wanted to gather a group of intergenerational leaders, both in person and online. A group composed of energized students, scientists, business executives, community members, activists, and entrepreneurs who are developing new solutions to drive meaningful stewardship of our planet. In the room tonight, we are honored to host a group of leaders from organizations such as WildAid, the Marine Mammal Center, Mission Blue, Island Conservation, Wildlife Conservation Network, California Ocean Alliance, Marine Conservation Institute, Felidae Conservation Fund, and OceanKind. We also have leaders from the private sector who are driving important initiatives around sustainability, the circular economy, and nurturing innovation from the likes of Google, Deloitte, SoftBank, Redpoint Ventures, Schmidt Marine Technology Partners, the Production Board, and Solar Software. And this community of leaders isn't just limited to this room. Our most important group are those of you who are joining us online. The online component of this discussion is with purpose. We wanted this dialogue to be born in the spirit of inclusion and openness to connect with those of you who want to embrace the environmental challenges of our generation and take on a leading role. And if that resonates, well, you are in the right place. Tonight's panel is called Technology, Innovation, and Intelligence in Conservation. This broadcast will dive into various ways leaders are successfully developing and leveraging technology to advance wildlife restoration, natural resource conservation, and planetary health initiatives. I'm pleased to be partnering with Sebastian Nichols, CEO of Sea Blue and president of the board of the International Ocean Film Festival, and Katie DeHaas, an emerging environmental leader at Heidrick & Struggles. Sebastian will be leading the Q&A portion of our panel with the live audience, and I've asked Katie to introduce our 4 fantastic panelists.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all so much for joining us in person and on the live stream tonight. I will be starting off by introducing Andrea Crosta. Andrea is co-founder and executive director of Earth League International, an organization that protects wildlife, oceans, and forests through intelligence and investigative operations, targeting illegal wildlife supply chains, environmental criminal organizations, traffickers, and corrupt government officials. Andrea has over 30 years of experience in conservation projects around the world. In a parallel professional career, he has been working for over 17 years as an international consultant to companies and governmental agencies on high-end security technologies and services, homeland security, anti-piracy, investigations, and risk management. Andrea is among the main protagonists of the Netflix documentary The Ivory Game and of the Nat Geo documentary Sea of Shadows, about the international trafficking of totoaba and the potential extinction of the Paquita porpoise in the Sea of Cortez, Mexico. He holds a master's degree in natural sciences, a master's degree in business and innovation, and a bachelor of science in psychology.
So I have to catch up with Andrea.
Yes, just a little bit. Next, Dr. Ray Wingrant. A fellow with the National Geographic Society, Ray is a large carnivore ecologist with an expertise in using statistical modeling to investigate how anthropogenic factors can influence the spatial patterns of carnivore behavior and ecology. Her current field system encompasses part of the Great Plains in northeastern Montana, where she is studying potential corridors to facilitate grizzly bear conservation. Ray sits on the Board of Governors for the Society for Conservation Biology and as a special director for the Explorers Club, where she largely aids the organizations in their equity, inclusion, and diversity strategies. She received her BS in Environmental Studies from Emory University, her MS in Environmental Studies from Yale University, and her PhD in Ecology and Evolution from Columbia University. Next, Will Marshall. Will Marshall is the co-founder and CEO of Planet Labs, a venture-backed satellite and Earth imaging company where he leads the overall company strategy and direction. Planet's imagery solutions have fundamentally changed how countries in the EU monitor activities such as illegal fishing and deforestation, and have helped governments support the adoption of improved Earth observation data to drive transparency and results in climate policies and finance. Prior to Planet, Will was a scientist at NASA/USRA. He received his PhD in physics from Oxford and his master's in physics with space and science and technology from the University of Leicester. Will is a postdoctoral fellow at George Washington University and Harvard. Lastly, Olani Wilhelm. For over 2 decades, Olani has worked to protect the ocean and the resources it provides. As the Senior Vice President of the Conservation International Center for Oceans, she will build on her past successes, helping to lead the designation of the Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument.
By the way, that's why Katie's doing
why
the
I'm doing
bios.
this.
I didn't want to be able to pronounce that.
I did my best. Marine National Monument, and founding the Big Ocean Network to protect the marine resources that people rely on for food, livelihoods, and culture. Olani brings to Conservation International more than 20 years of experience in natural resource management, primarily ocean conservation. She led the designation of one of the largest areas on Earth and first of its kind to honor indigenous relationships to the sea and the importance of global ocean heritage. Previously, she served as Director of Ocean Initiatives for the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries and was a 2014-2015 Social Innovation Fellow at Stanford University, focused on island-scaled social enterprise. She founded both Island Water and Big Ocean, is a chair of the IUCN WCPA Large-Scale Marine Protected Area Task Force, and served as an advisor to UNESCO's Marine World Heritage Program. She holds a Master of Science from Stanford University and a bachelor degree from the University of Southern California. Thank you all so much for taking part in our panel, and I'll hand it over to Scott from here.
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah.
That's great.
Not sure where that bio
Enough accomplishments? So now that we know our panel, let's get going here, and let's just start opening it up. So, Will, I'm going to actually start with you on this question. So we'll go through 2 or 3 different questions, but this will be more organic in feel. But the first question, each of you represent a pioneer who is developing new or utilizing existing technology to advance your mission. Can each of you talk about how you think about the interconnection of technology and conservation, and how does it play into your life's work? And Will, you're the most pure technologist, which is why I wanted to start with you first.
Yeah, so, at Planet, we left NASA with this mission of imaging the entire Earth every day to have more up-to-date information about our changing planet. On the basic thesis that you can't manage what you can't measure. It's pretty simple hypothesis, and at that time, imagery at the kind of resolutions we're talking about was being taken every few years of the planet. So you wake up at the end of a few years and there's a big hole in the Amazon, which is really nice to know about, but it's even better if you catch it during the deforestation process so that you can actually stop it in the act. It's all about getting data on or inside the decision-making loop of the phenomena that you're trying to take care of, and in this case, we're mainly trying to take care of our spaceship, the Earth, that has 7 billion little astronauts on board, and we're having a big collision course between those 7 billion astronauts and the rest of the wildlife ecosystems. I think, the tragedy can't be understated of where we're at. I mean, we've had the Australian fires recently, but that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's going on. And we've roughly exterminated about half of the life on the Earth in rough terms. I mean, much more than half in terms of numbers of animals, like 82% of the wild mammals, 70% of the fish in rivers and lakes, 75% of the insects, over half of the world's corals that are alive when I was born are gone, and but less than 50% when thinking about the number of species. And that's more like 30%, but we're whittling them away at a devastating rate of about 15% per decade. So just to lay some facts on the ground, it's a really tragic situation we find ourselves in, and humanity is on a collision course with the rest of the species on the Earth. And the way out of that, a lot of that, actually, interestingly enough, people think about it as focused on climate change. It's not climate change actually that's driving that decimation of wildlife. It's land use change. It's turning forests and prime tropical forests in particular into agricultural lands or other land uses, or it's basically it's habitat destruction. And so we need to take better use of our land. And I mean, there's a few key thrusts to that: more efficient agriculture and sustainable agriculture, which can then feed the populace without having to destroy more forests for it, as well as enable more wildlife on those lands. You've got to create more parks and reserved lands. And of course, we also have to tackle the climate change issue and reduce the carbon debt, which also sustainable agriculture helps. And of course, stopping deforestation helps. But you also have to turn off all the coal power plants. There's really three big parts of the solution here. But land use fits into at least two parts of the big buckets. And understanding that and having the data on the timescale of decision making on this big collision course between humans and the rest of life is what we need to be able to take care of that.
And well, I was actually blown away by one image that I saw. I think it was of the palm oil industry in the Pacific.
Yeah.
And I'd love if you could just share with us maybe one or two case studies or examples of maybe it's related to land use where Planet has engaged with a client and it's led to some major impact from a
I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, in Brazil, we're working with the government there to actually our data has been used in court of law to prove that landowners have let land deforestation on their land, without which they were just there was no enforcement. And so millions of dollars of fines were levied last year on the back of our data. So stopping deforestation is one. Helping protect preserve lands, so parks. We discovered a gold mine that was being built in a park in Peru, and the only reason people have found out about it is because there was lead poisoning of some people downstream, and they were like, "What the heck? Can you have a look?" We had a look. There's this big illegal gold mine in the middle of the preserve. That anyway, then the Navy subsequently shut down in that country. And recently we did a really cool project mapping all the world's coral reefs, which in partnership with the Vulcan Institute and Carnegie Institute of Science down at Stanford, where we not only did the first classification of all the world's corals, which had never been done, it turned out, but revisiting them every day, and if there's any signs of early bleaching or illegal fishing on those corals, we can now get in there and stop that. So it's all about monitoring marine protected areas and coral reef systems. A couple of examples.
Yeah.
There's zillions of those. I mean, the world's your oyster with this data set. It's really a data set that helps us take care of the planet.
And I think I saw a recent partnership that you all struck with the state of California and Bloomberg.
Yes, exactly. We work with Gavin Newsom and Mike Bloomberg on a partnership where it's called Satellites for Climate Action. And basically it's all about, the first project is actually monitoring all the world's coal power plants and checking their decommissioning status is on track with whatever they said they were going to be doing. I don't know if you know, Mike Bloomberg has this whole effort of decommissioning coal power plants where he's basically paying them to go offline, which is really cool. And we're helping to monitor the heck out of that by monitoring the thousands and thousands of coal power plants all around the world.
Yeah, thank you.
No worries.
I know a lot of us in the world are familiar with what we're talking about. And at Hopkins, there's actually a GIS class that's taught. I don't know, Katie, if we could put up really quickly the image to give people an example of the satellite imagery. And this is This is in Australia. Will, I don't know if you might be able to talk about this specifically.
Yeah, I mean, this is the fires going on in Australia. It's millions and millions of hectares of land that is currently on alight or been already burnt down. 500 million animals, and that doesn't include the insects and the frogs and the bats, which weren't counted in the survey. So it's a terrible amount of wildlife loss. Of course, interruption to human activity as well. But I most often think about the rest of the species which don't tend to be in these rooms and voting, so to speak, in the parliaments.
Yeah. And often, I mean, and Marion, I don't know if we can just, when we look at this, sometimes when you're looking at images from space, you can not necessarily see what's going on, but we do have one person who's whose family's being affected by the fires, and she's nice enough to tell us a little bit about how it's affecting her family.
Hi, everyone. Well, yeah, it's obviously pretty devastating what's happened and currently is happening back home. But effectively, I grew up in rural Australia, so we're in the midst of, well, I should say my parents and my brothers are in the midst of trying to defend the property at the moment. And I think for my parents, we have about 150 horses on the property. I think the most difficult part of all of this for them is, protecting the wildlife. And, they'll be fine. But I think there's currently like 700 fires happening at the moment. About 2,000 homes have been destroyed. Fortunately, no one within my immediate family, but obviously part of my community. There's a lot of homes that have obviously been destroyed and continue to be damaged. And I think what's scary is that the reality is that we all had warning, in the sense that the drought has been going on for a long period of time. The heat and the temperatures have been constantly rising over the last few years. The situation within California last year, as well as obviously what's happened in the Amazon and other parts. It's just disappointing that I think the world has already been warned, and it's kind of gotten to the point now that I don't think Australia is going to be the only continent affected, whether it's fires or rising sea levels, etc. And I think the most devastating aspect of this is, us humans can relocate ourselves and maybe have sufficient warning, but, all of the wildlife and plants and all of the habitats are just being totally destroyed.
Thank you, Marion. I appreciate that. And our love to our brothers and sisters in Australia. One of the things that I wish, I told Will this before, and we're working with him on some projects right now, but I chased Will for for at least 3 years to work with Planet, because I had the opportunity to see the California droughts happen in real time, and then the fires hit. And so it's nothing on the scale that's happening in Australia, but I definitely, my heart goes out to across the sea. Just switching really quickly, and we could talk for hours just about Planet Labs. Ray, maybe we can talk a little bit about you, because I know in the work that you do, and maybe you can explain it to the audience, but you make use of geospatial technologies quite frequently.
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, thank you all for having me. It's wonderful to be here. I hope some of my Johns Hopkins students are tuning in, so hi to you guys. Some of my Johns Hopkins students right now are in the Congo Basin on a field course that I organized for them and paved the way for them last year. So wishing them a lot of health and safety and a great experience. But for those of you in the room, I was born and raised in San Francisco. So as like one of the few, I think, native San Franciscans, I see you in the back. It's always wonderful to be back. The city, of course, has changed by leaps and bounds since the mid-'80s, but it's still home. So yeah, I'm very grateful for a lot of the remote sensing work that gets done and a lot of technology that gets done. I'm a large carnivore ecologist. I mainly study African lions and North American black bears and grizzly bears. And what that means in terms of my work is that I do all of the data collection, and then geospatial technology, high-level statistical analysis software comes into play in the data analysis end, which then allows me to publish papers, which then get translated by science communicators and delivered to the public. So what I do, and I'll use grizzly bears as an example, my current study system is in eastern Montana, where I'm studying a recolonizing population of grizzly bears. That means that they were wiped out, were driven to near extinction in eastern Montana about 120, 150 years ago. And conservation efforts have worked so well in places like Yellowstone National Park and Glacier National Park on the western side of the state that grizzly bears are. I usually have maps behind me to show what's going on, but they are quite literally walking on their forepaws back home to their native and ancestral landscape in the Great Plains. So I get in there with bears and I capture them, tranquilize them, and attach GPS collars to them. So it looks like a big dog collar, and it has a little very lightweight device on it, which is a GPS unit. It bounces to a satellite in outer space, and then that satellite sends the geospatial location right to my computer. So in a nutshell, this wonderful, wonderful technology allows me to essentially make assumptions about an entire animal population by using just a few individuals. So instead of having to capture and take years and years and years to count every single grizzly bear and get all of their movement information, I can take a sample of a population. So my goal is to get 10 grizzly bears this summer, attach GPS collars to them, and be able to track their movements. So the GPS device that I work with takes a location fix every 4 hours. And so I'm able to track their movements every 4 hours and look at spatial patterns. And essentially what I'm looking at is the way that they move on the landscape. So that's a type of wildlife behavior. And looking at the way they move, the habitats that they choose to spend time in versus the habitats that they choose to avoid can tell us a lot about the ecology of an animal. A lot of people think, oh, it's a bear, so it loves the forest. But there are parts of the forest that a bear will never go to. And this helps us answer questions about why. There's an extra element of what I do, and that includes people. So grizzly bears in Montana are recolonizing space that looks a lot different from 150 years ago, or a lot different from thousands of years ago when they first evolved on the landscape. There's a lot of people. In particular, there's a lot of agriculture. There's a lot of cattle ranching, a lot of farmland. So these bears are not just trying to navigate an ancestral home, the return to an ancestral home, but also navigate all of the highways, all of the wheat fields, all of the millet fields and the lentil fields. I bet you didn't know your lentils come from Montana, but they do. And most importantly, all of the cattle ranches that can be quite dangerous for them. And so that type of ecology is an emerging field of understanding wildlife ecology, right? How they use human landscapes or how they might avoid human landscapes. And that has direct conservation implications. So if we really understand how these grizzly bears are navigating human landscapes to get to a protected area, that can help us with other carnivore populations that will hopefully start to rebound soon, like tiger populations that are trying to recolonize their landscapes. African lion populations, even some marine carnivores that have to now try to survive in human landscapes. So a lot of this geospatial information just allows us to collect lots and lots and lots of data and then do high-level statistics to look at patterns. And the last thing I'll say about that, because no one wants to hear about statistics, but they are really important. And so I want to kind of double down on the importance of this data. You do? You care about statistics? Okay, so we can talk later. But I create what we call statistical models, and it's essentially using current information, so for example, geospatial information, to project what's going to happen in the future. So how bears are moving now, that data helps me make models and predictions of how bears are going to move in the future. The habitats they select now, I can project into what they might do in the future. And then I get to test those models. So over time, I get to see, well, are they using these pathways that I think they're going to use? Are they using these corridors? Are they using these habitats? And then with something like climate change, we're able to make adjustments in real time. So the ultimate goal is to make sure that there is the right type of protected landscapes for bears by the time that they actually get there. And that is the ultimate goal, getting ahead of conservation issues while we still can. So I'm quite dependent on all of this technology.
Yeah. And it's interesting because the technology has such different applications. For Ray, as a wildlife biologist, it's very much rooted in science. Andrea, for you, I mean, we're talking about data collection and collecting data, but you use the word intelligence, and that's your currency that you trade on is intelligence. Maybe you can share a little bit about where you spend your time, and what tools and things you rely on in the course of the work that you do.
Sure. So my field is environmental crime. Unfortunately for me, unlike my colleagues, I never see an animal alive, basically. I deal with a lot of people, most of them bad people. And in the field of environmental crime, there are different players, different actors, different NGOs. Some of them are into poaching, anti-poaching. Some others are into capacity building and training, the provision of equipment, awareness campaigns. We specifically use basically intelligence techniques to collect information, produce intelligence, and investigate illegal supply chains on different things. We are working right now on rhino horn, on jaguar parts, on illegal fishing as well. And it started a few years ago. I was in Kenya with my previous job, so it's sort of like security sector, dealing with intelligence and different things, and in the middle of the elephant poaching crisis, despite millions of dollars of investment, we were losing 35,000, 40,000 elephants per year in Africa. And I saw it all, and I could see almost the question marks on the head of the rangers. They were trying to do their best. So I started to ask myself, why nobody uses professional intelligence to understand what's going on. There were a bunch of organizations doing good investigative work, but more as an activist. And I said, why? If you look at other global threats like terrorism, like narco-trafficking, like organized crime, intelligence is really the heart of our strategy to fight back. Why it doesn't happen with environmental crime? It's the fourth largest criminal endeavor on the planet. We're talking about $260 billion per year. The worst possible people are involved, very sophisticated trafficking networks, and yet there's no intelligence. So, crazy me, I decided to, okay, let's try to build one. Let's try to build what one day maybe will be the first intelligence agency for the planet. So I started to talk with former FBI, former CIA, crime analysts, and I started recruiting them as advisor, we have a great team of white hackers, and the idea is to sort of replicate what a classic intelligence agency does, but for the planet. So 5 years later, we're here, and so we use a variety of, we mix technology with human intelligence. So we use, on the one hand, we have a very old tradecraft, so the art of intelligence, which is mostly about human intelligence, so having people building networks of informants around the world, sources of informant, recruiting different people, collecting different material. Unlike investigation or intelligence is 24/7 at 360 degrees collection of and analysis of information, so it never stops. And then we use technologies, mostly softwares to make sense of what we collect, of the information that we get. So we have like an interesting way of working with a lot of information coming from the field. And then we have a cyber team that is really good in getting additional information, mostly from the deep web. So we are able, for example, to connect this person or this name or this email coming from the field with that organization and that politician and that bank account, for example. And then our analysts do an incredible, precious work in putting everything together. And the final products are usually two, one for the public, a public report, and one confidential brief for law enforcement only. So we have been sharing in the past 4 or 5 years a lot of information with more than a dozen law enforcement agencies around the world. We are currently sharing also with US. And that's, so the idea is to, so I'm finishing. So what I didn't like 5 years ago, and I still don't like now when I look at the problem, so everyone, governments, media, donors, the public, we are overly focused on the two ends of these supply chains. Either the origin, so poaching, ground zero, or the other end, which is the consumer, so awareness campaigns. So millions of dollars are going to anti-poaching, which is about poor people try to make a living very often. They became the villain, but they are not. Or important awareness campaigns, but takes time. And imagine to fight terrorism like this. Imagine to fight narco trafficking just by busting someone around the corner and doing awareness. I mean, it will be the end of our world. And so why we don't do it for environmental crimes? The reasons are two. One is governments is not a priority for governments, so they don't set up an intelligence services for that, and becomes also very tricky with other existing intelligence services, and then they have to do something in another country, so they're never going to do it. And big NGOs, they don't have the mindset, they don't like risk usually, they don't need risk, and also they have invested millions of dollars of projects around the world in each country. They have staff and offices in each country. The minute they start doing investigation and intelligence, they will be kicked out. So the end is nobody's doing it. And so we are in the business like him, but in a different way, and like her, in the business of information, but a different kind. And one day I would love to see all this information centralized and used in a centralized manner. Right now, it's not.
Alani, I'd love to turn to you. Thank you, Andrea. I'd love to turn to you on this same topic and question.
Well, it's funny when well, aloha, everyone. I'm from Hawaii, so if I slip in a few Hawaiian words, forgive me. When my husband found out that I was going to be talking in Silicon Valley about technology, he laughed. I use about 0.5% of the capacity of my iPhone, I'm sure. I did a lot of my early work, on remote atolls, hanging out with seabirds. And if my children could go to school there, we'd probably still be there. And so when I think about it, and I come from a culture where if I think about the 3 words or the 3 themes, technology, innovation, and intelligence, for me, where that goes is, really the deepest part of kind of early human-centered design. In Silicon Valley, we talk about that from a design standpoint. We think about, empathy-driven and utilitarian approaches to innovation. And I know when I was at the D School for a little while at Stanford, I remember I was like, okay, I'm going to go and learn about the design, this whole, cycle of design. I'm saying there, okay, so we're going to identify a problem. Like, okay. And then we're going to talk to people and find out, what do they need? And learn from them. What problems are they trying to solve? Okay? And then we're going to come up with an idea. Awesome. And then we're going to see if it works, and we're going to ask them how they feel, and then we're going to modify that design. I'm still waiting for the magic. Now, I'm making fun of this a little bit, because for me, that was native intelligence. That's the intelligence, very, very clear kind of indigenous intelligence. People, if we think about our native selves as human beings, it's kind of the core of utilitarian design, about surviving, about being able to ask questions and solve problems. So it made me start to think, how did we as human beings get so far away? When I think about technology, I think about the earliest of technology before the wheel, which was the outrigger. True fact. Before people were walking across the land bridge, people were sailing. coastal, and then across. And I come from the people who later, after all of this cool technology was developed, made it to the most remote parts of the Pacific. I come from the most remote archipelago on the planet, even though most people think it's off the coast of Baja California because of really bad maps, right next to Alaska. And you know the maps I'm talking about. When you think about, this technology, you think about where did that come from? These are from cultures and peoples who recorded data in their songs, in their chants, in the myths, in the legends. This was all data. And when you think about how we can draw from that and what was so special, how could my ancestors colonize the biggest planet, the biggest ocean on the planet, or if you stuck all the land masses on Earth inside of the Pacific, you still had plenty of room to swim around. How did people do that? And it was about proximity and affinity with nature. The relationship was familial. The relationship was so intimate because survival depended on it, right? And so we have come as kind of human populations away from that, and I think it's really important to use this confluence of technology, innovation, and intelligence to help us return to a closeness to the planet. Because we're not going to help to protect what we don't know and we don't love. And that familiar intimacy, when you're thinking you're taking care of your elder cousins or your grandmother, you hold that a lot differently than when I think about I'm saving a protected resource. And the very kind of sanitized way we start thinking about this. And why then do we have supply chains full of criminal activity where people don't value those things? Or because it's so perverse, and the drivers of it are so perverse that it forces us out of other extreme human situations that we have to remove ourselves from nature. So for me, as a manager, and I'll put that manager hat, I don't collect the data. I rely on these really smart people to help us answer the management questions we need, to then help collect the information, synthesize, visualize this, help us to understand in real time what that means, because that is, again, helping us return, hopefully, to an intimacy. If my kids can get on their iPhone and start looking at data and start going, wait, I visited there, I live there, this is a place where my family and my 150 horses are. And that's a tragic story, by the way. My heart goes out to your family. If we're able to personalize through this data, to me, that's some of the most exciting components of being able to do it. And I've seen huge shifts in my 20 years in marine conservation where the technology is mind-blowing. Just even alone what DNA has unlocked and what we used to do in terms of collecting biological information and how we're able to speed that up, it's remarkable. So how can we use technology to speed up our connection to our heart and our spirit, to our land and ocean, and return to that indigeneity that we all come from? Maybe it's many generations ago, but if you go far enough back, you really realize that's the human connection we have. And so to me, how can we really utilize technology to repersonalize and create those relationships again? Because if we care, then I think we'll make better decisions. And if we think about longevity and stop thinking about ourselves as descendants, descended from this great, that, and everything, and we have this entitlement mentality, imagine the decisions we'd make if we thought about what kind of ancestor we'll be. And I think we need to start thinking about that question a lot younger because time's a ticking.
I love this. As I'm just thinking about each of our panelists, we have, we're talking about native intelligence. We're talking about also citizen science that I know, Ray, you rely on quite a bit. We're also talking about intelligence as it relates to narco trafficking. And the applications are just limitless in terms of how we can think about impacting the environment. I want to move to, we talked a lot about tech. I want to turn a little bit more and make this a little bit more personal and hear from some of our panelists, as each of them have had unbelievably successful careers. And I'd be curious, just looking back, what are some of the lessons learned that you would share with people listening in? And I ask because our audience is, especially online, filled with environmentally minded people who have lofty ideas, maybe crazy ideas, and they're unsure how to act on them. I will pose that to the group. I don't know if any of you have something off the top of your head. If not, I might go to Ray.
And thank you,
Yeah.
sure, unless anyone else wants to jump in. Lessons learned, a million of them. I mean, certainly one of the lessons learned, Scott, is that you got to measure success, for yourself, because certainly working in wildlife conservation, it's a lot of failure, right? We have fewer and fewer wild animals, endangered species every single day, as Andrea mentioned, with some of those really scary numbers. So what does it mean to be a successful wildlife conservation scientist? You really have to really pull it back on yourself to make sure that you are putting in your best effort, to make sure that you're communicating the issues correctly. And these days, I also think it means that you are making sure that all of the people who deserve to have a seat at the table have that seat at the table. And that can get me into a whole other branch of, equity and inclusion in this work. But conservation as a field, the way that we as Americans understand it, is a truly American construct, but it has undeniably indigenous roots. And yet indigenous folks are often left out of the conversations, out of the leadership, out of the management, the decision making. So I am so glad that we have somebody who has an expertise in indigenous and traditional ecological knowledge, but that is something that's a lesson learned. That the conservation pedagogy that's being taught, that has been taught, is often leaving out this really, really critical element. I'm also grateful that there are wider conversations, as Andrea already mentioned, around really changing the messaging about a lot of things like wildlife crime. If you think of the African context, the South American or Asian context, we're often vilifying people living in poverty for getting an illegal job to feed their families and incarcerating those people. Certainly in the United States, I think we can say that we've learned that incarcerating poor people is not a means to an end. And so those conversations, some of us have learned it. And it's certainly something that I am grateful is included in conversations more. But as a lesson learned, it's something that someone like me had to come to on my own, because it's not a staple of science education or conservation education. And I'll give another example just because I love talking about poaching, even though it's not my area to work in, but there's a lot of poaching that goes on in this country too. So I'm someone who studies large carnivores and bears, and they have a value on the illegal wildlife market. So every so often I am running into wildlife mysteries of how this bear ended up killed with its gallbladder missing. And it is because folks in California and Nevada and Montana that look like a lot of us here are going out there and illegally killing animals and selling their body parts on the black market. And that is also a story that does not come up, right, in the messaging that we get about a lot of these issues. I could go on about lessons learned. I'm actually happy to go on about lessons learned. There's one that I particularly want to convey, especially to the students that are joining us remotely. And a big one for me is that, as privileged as I am to have had so much academic training and, a PhD and a postdoc and all of that, it is not required to have a PhD to work with wild animals. And that is a huge lesson that I learned the hard way at the end of all of this. But there's such a need for people to work in conservation, all types of conservation, all types of environmental protection. And there is a level of education necessary, but it's not necessarily required all the way up to these extreme, kind of terminal degree levels. The quicker we get people engaged in protecting the environment, and the quicker that we adopt the, truly valuing traditional ecological knowledge and, kind of these alternative or non-traditional knowledge sources. Non-traditional in academia, not non-traditional in life. The more we'll have more people working on these issues and more folks at the table. So to a lot of the students here, get your master's degrees. They will be wildly helpful, but don't necessarily think that you need to delay and get all kinds of experience to work with bears. The folks that I work with don't have PhDs. It's just me. And I'd rather see people just getting in there and diving in.
Thanks, Ray. Will,
Can
you
I
put
riff
your
off
hand
that?
up?
Yeah,
Of course.
yeah. I was just imagining these bears with PhDs. So, it's good that they don't. I also wanted to riff that of course, it's a tragedy that there's not much inclusion of indigenous populations around these discussions of conservation. I totally agree. There's even less of inclusion, almost exactly zero, of those other species and their voice. In fact, the only general time that we include them in the conversation is when we're eating them in the conversation. So, a whole other thing about rights of species, and I love what New Zealand is doing in giving rights and legal rights to mountains and rivers and certain other ecological things, because I mean that's the kind of progression we need to take these things and entities seriously. Anyway, I wanted to get to the sort of reflections for and advice and lessons learned. I would say there's a few things that come to my mind. One is that pick what you want to do based on the impact. Vote with your feet. There's many a startup around here that claim to be helping the world, but they're not. There's some app that doesn't do anything useful. In fact, it often just wastes people's time. Do something useful. And that if you can't find it in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, then you need some good justification. That doesn't mean that everything's perfectly in there, but if it's roughly not in there at all, you need to be seriously making a question mark about whether or not that's useful. Is it feeding people? Is it business, if you solve real problems, there'll be a massive value proposition around it, I mean, Google didn't start with a business plan. They started with how do we solve search, because that enables people to get information, The best businesses don't come out of business plans. They come out of creating real societal value that then gets rewarded financially. If you're smart people, you can get financial means around it. So vote with your feet and doing something that's really important for the planet. Second thing I'd do is, I'd say is the almost singular defining factor of what I have seen makes the difference between those that succeed and those that don't is not timing or ideas, although those are both important ingredients, but rather persistence. Persistence and endurance is the one distinguishing feature that all the entrepreneurs that I know that have done any good or done well with their entities that's the defining feature by far. It's that look at Elon, he's sleeping on night shifts or whatever in his lab. He doesn't have to do that. He's a billionaire. He can walk off, do whatever he likes. He is doing that work. He is persistent, man, if there's something you can't take away from him. And I would say that the other and related thing is if you don't have an idea that's distinctly better than other, it's totally cool to join other projects that are doing other good things. I mean, one of the things that I think is going on in the world right now is we have thousands of disparate approaches to helping climate and stopping environmental destruction. And that's a challenge because those approaches, those organic and haphazard approaches, which are often various degrees of success or overlap, aren't coordinated. And I think this is the time when humanity needs to focus down and pare down to a few key projects that are actually going to solve most of the problem, not try and do thousands and thousands that aren't really empirically getting us anywhere. And as I said, there's really only a couple. We need to sustain the forests and plant some more trees and preserve lands. There's sort of parks and trees. There's sustainable agriculture, which is a quarter of the land area of the earth, and that we also need to sustain. And then there's switching the coal power plants to solar. Those are the ones that if we have those marine and land parks, we have the sustainable ag, and we have the switching from coal to solar. We've got 80% of the way there, and so we need to focus down and perhaps it's enough time for new technology and ideas. It's more time for joining and focusing on some of those projects to pare down. Sustainable ag, as an example, doesn't need much new technology. I mean, we actually help quite a bit with agriculture because we can tell crop type and yield in each of our pixels around the planet. But generally, we don't need new technology for that. We just need to change certain practices and not have tilling anymore and a few other things, and then we'll do a much better job of storing carbon and feeding the planet in a healthy way. So, anyway, paring down and focusing rather than doing this is, I think, what humanity needs a little bit right now. It's my just perception.
No one asked the moderator, and in these 4 panels, I'm not going to get any 2 cents in here, but I will say...
Scott, what do you think?
Thank you, Will. One of the lessons learned for me going through this program has been, yes, we need to move to renewables, and we need to think about solar. But, if there is a huge demand placed on manufacturing solar panels or lithium-ion batteries. Well, we're going to have to mine for those materials. And where are we thinking about mining right now? Bristol Bay in Alaska, which is a huge, I mean, it's an environment where we depend on salmon stocks to feed the world. So that's been a quick lesson for me is it's not just do this, it's bringing the environmental and ecological mindset to each one of these problems that we're trying to solve. I think we can do it through capital markets, but we need to be a little bit more nuanced in all of these complexities. I'm done. I'll get off my soapbox.
No, I mean, if there's one little bright thing that I think climate is delivering for us, I know this is a stretch, is that it's normalizing the conversations around what was conservation or environmentalism into like survival, life, like food, being able to have economies that are circular so that we can still be able to like persist into a future, you know, even in a much shorter time frame. It's bringing closer to home all of that. And I think that is something that we really, it's stopping us from saying, oh, conservation is for the privileged, right? That basically, you know, when something's burning, it doesn't matter what your socioeconomic status is, right? When sea levels are rising, this is affecting all of us at the same time. It's a great normalizer in a really sad way. And so we need to be realizing that we're all part of that. And I think that is driving different conversations. You know, I have 3 kids, and my youngest, when he was 7, you know, we tell stories at night, and we usually read them, or I try to practice oral storytelling and making up stories or sharing ones we've heard, so they get a choice, or he did at the time, he's older now, and said, you know, he said, Mom, I don't want to read a story, I want you to tell me a story tonight. It's like, great, what do you want me to tell you a story about? He said, Mom, tell me a story about what the planet was like before the climate changed.
Wow. That's cool.
It's powerful.
When you were 7, did you have to worry about or think about, like, and you don't know when you're 7, what does that even mean? But at a fundamental 7-year-old level, he knew that once upon a time there was this planet that was kind of awesome. And then it changed. And then he was born. And the planet's not really awesome. Right? That's not acceptable. And they're growing up in a belief of that this is kind of coming to the end, and that's going to drive value change. That's going to drive behavioral change in a way that either you're going to go to great hope or maybe great despair. And that's on us, right, to think about. So one lesson is we have to perpetuate hope, and not false hope, but hope by backing it up with action. So that's what I'm hearing from what everyone's saying here is like, get on with it, right? So what do you want to do? What is in your heart's desire? Like, where do you think you can have the most impact? And maybe it's related to an SDG. Maybe it's related to your geography where you live, but kind of get on with it. We have a principle of value in Hawaii called kuleana. If you've ever heard this word, it's the duality of privilege and responsibility. It's the same word, privilege and responsibility. And a lot of times, if we go through school, or you have your parents, or you have professors or graduate school advisors who want to help tell you what your kuleana might be. Here's the study you should do. I'm making fun a little bit. Or your parents know you should go and do this. What I had to learn is that you really need to know your own kuleana. What is it? Not some kind of responsibility or privilege someone else gave you, but what is that uniquely yours? And you know, it's that thing that kind of makes your heart, you know, beat, and that really gives you that fulfillment, because this stuff's hard. Working in this space is really hard. And like somebody said, what we're doing is we're trying to stave decline. Right? We're not like, yay, we have these big wins. You have some of those stories, but we're really trying to celebrate like staving decline. So you have to be in the headspace of hope. You have to be in the headspace that I'm really onto it. And I also think part of why I went to business school, and when I was in business school, people were like, what are you doing here? Like, you work in oceans and like, you know, culture, and what are you doing in business school? And I'm like, I'm getting my decoder ring. Because this language that we're speaking and these ways of thinking about things, we need to bring the discipline of business and acumen into how we think about environmentalism, because mostly we do cool stuff. We don't do bad things typically, or at least we don't intend to. It's a lot of little bits of good. But if you look out in the world, we don't have time for little bits of good. We need transformational awesome. right? We need to think about and make
That's a good quote.
really clear judgments, and we need to put the limited resources we have, whether it be technology or whatever, into transformational good. And that's where thinking about failing fast, thinking about innovation, thinking about who we're serving and how to engage more people is going to be important, so that we don't just go, gosh, we did this little thing while the whole thing's falling apart. Right? We have to change our mindset that environmentalism is something separate and like something we do on the weekend. Right? It's no more, because if you're hungry, if you're fighting a fire, if you're, you don't have a house, you don't have health, you can't be a conservationist. So we have to stop separating those things.
And Alani, I mean, we were talking about looking at jobs that might be aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, but it could be, environmental leadership could be being a champion of recycling and composting in your household. If it doesn't exist in your community, being a champion with the municipality to get that pushed forward. It could be pursuing a profession that's aligned with that. And I am a headhunter, and I always get what is a headhunter doing in this space? There are opportunities, no matter what you're doing, to align your values with something professionally and personally. So I just wanted to touch on that. Andrea, really quickly, want to give you the opportunity, and then we're going to go to Q&A.
So she said that you don't need a PhD to start working with bears, and I add that you actually don't need a degree in biology and science to work in conservation, and actually we really need different backgrounds. Not extreme as my story, maybe, but I started with a master degree in biology and zoology, but then I went into business with another master degree. In '98, I established one of the very first, actually the second e-commerce companies in Italy. It was the prehistory of e-commerce in '98 in Europe. Wow. And then from there, I went to other kind of technologies, and then I got into security, intelligence, and then I went back to conservation. And now a lot of things that I did and learned, now they're all very, very useful. And that's why, personally, I like to work with people coming from all kind of backgrounds. They're usually very rich people. They usually really think out of the box. They take risk, something that you don't see anymore. I mean, to take in risk and even fail miserably doesn't matter. So I like these people, and so I invite young people to embrace this approach.
Thank you. We're going to move now to the Q&A component, and we'll start here in the room. And for those of you who are on the online broadcast, feel free to start to log questions in. Sebastian's going to start to field some of those for us as well. Really quickly, if you could wait here in the room, just wait until Katie comes in and gives you a microphone before you ask your question. It'll help us from not doing it 2 times in a row. So, and I don't know if anyone has a first question. Oh, Karen, thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. That was absolutely wonderful. All the ideas and thoughts and work that you're doing.
Karen, real quick, and
Yes.
this is for everyone. If
Sure.
you could just announce name and who you are, and
Sure.
in addition to the question, that'd be great.
I'm Karen Poyani. I'm the CEO of Island Conservation. We're an organization, NGO, that saves island species by eradicating invasive species. And one of the things that we struggle with a lot are unintended consequences, especially with technology and changing dynamics. I wonder if anybody wants to speak to the fact of unintended consequences and how we can be thoughtful about them.
I will just pipe up to say that, that's something we're all guilty of. And by all of us, I mean all of us as, kind of fairly privileged Americans that can access spaces like this. And, my example, something that was kind of thrown in my face recently, I was on a Johns Hopkins funded mini expedition to the Congo Basin last year this time, where the students are now. and found myself in a part of Central Africa where there's a lot of lithium mining. And a lot of child slavery and adult slavery that goes into lithium mining. And so I'm someone who is really, really motivated by the fact that I can now access technology that tracks these grizzly bears that I'm trying to save from extinction using my iPhone. Yet my iPhone's lithium battery comes from child slaves in the Congo Basin where I was last year this time.
Wow.
Right? So that's not necessarily my own, I didn't drive that consequence, but a lot of us live in this duality of wanting to do something really good for the planet while simultaneously contributing to something that is destroying people and livelihoods and families and communities and as well as the environment. So I don't have a direct answer for that, but it is not helpful to be quiet about that type of systemic change that we need. I know a lot about animals and wild animals and whatnot, but until I was chatting with folks in the Congo Basin, I was unaware that my purchasing of a smartphone, any smartphone, was contributing to a really terrible social issue that if I were in their place, it would be life-ruining. So I think there is a role of advocacy, in all of our work. I think all of us up here are advocates in some way or another. But I truly believe one of my values is adding some type of advocacy into whatever you do for a living. Like say you never, contribute money to a wildlife conservation organization, fine. But find some type of advocacy to include in your work, in your life, to try to eliminate some of these horrible problems, please.
Yeah, I was going to just say that, of course, these things are very tricky, and I think there's a lot of techno-utopianism in the Bay Area that's kind of crazy when you first get here. But, some of these things I think people avoid thinking about because they're not engineering, so we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. But that's just, lax thinking in a way. I mean, a lot of those things, like the example you just pointed out, are reasonably understandable if you actually just bother. So we've all just got to be thoughtful about it, right? And I think what tech companies can do is establish little diverse teams of people that have different disciplines, lawyers and philosophers and ethicists and people with different mindsets to think through the implications of their technology in society. Of course, you don't want to burden people that 3 people in a garage at that stage. You've got to have a multidisciplinary team that checks all your technology and how. But at a certain stage, you really do need that kind of team that checks, does that thinking, that thinks those things through. It's not that hard. It's not rocket science. In another sense, it's actually easier. I mean, if you actually want to model it out, almost impossible. But to just reasonably figure out a simple chain of events like the one you were just mentioning is not that hard. So let's at least do those things, and that's the best thing I can say about that.
Sebastian, I'd love to take a question from the audience. And thank you, Karen.
We have one question from Jimmy Cha, an alum of the Johns Hopkins Environmental Program. He asked, what are some examples of emerging technologies that might play crucial roles in conservation and environmentalist efforts in the near future?
Go for it.
I mean, I've got a ton, but I'll tell you guys about one of my recent favorites. And that is just the amazing amount of genetics work. So, there's technology related to microbiology. And genetics work is really allowing us to identify the presence of rare and endangered species and elusive species in some places. So I found myself in a rainforest in Madagascar recently, where we were looking for some of Madagascar's most critically endangered species and not finding any. And it's really, really important to be able to declare this rainforest has none of these species, right? But one of the people who was invited, one of the biologists who was invited, actually studies leeches and what can be found within leeches, right? So Again, there is technology here, but it's also just some really cool biology that I love to talk about. So there are all kinds of leeches in the rainforest of Madagascar. My favorite are tree leeches that are actually not in water bodies, but because it rains so much, they hang out in the leaves of trees, and then when it rains, they fall onto your head and down your shirt and in your backpack and all of that. But they also fall onto different animal species and suck their blood. And so just grabbing some of those leeches, unfortunately sacrificing them, and then taking some of the blood out of their stomachs, and then doing some DNA barcoding work to identify which animal species blood is in that leech belly, allows us to find sometimes the presence of species that we were not able to identify with our eyes. And that can help us say, this rainforest still deserves to be saved because this critically endangered species is here somewhere, even if we can't see it with our eyes. And that is incredibly important. Coupled with other things, coupled with audio soundscapes, right? That's another way to have audio recordings in order to identify, well, how many? Can we hear a male and a female of this frog species? That means there's a mating pair. That means there's a future of this species. You know, couple that with traditional indigenous knowledge. And then on top of that, just kind of that basic Western biology that I was taught in school actually gives us a lot of hope for how we can design conservation that's relevant for the future.
Can I riff off of that? So I was gonna talk about eDNA in the ocean, because you can go and now, you know, grab seawater, shake it up, find out what's in there, little pieces of remaining things, and do very similar to absence, presence, at least, maybe even some. It's new stuff, and it relates to the question before of unintended consequences. Because on one hand, that's super exciting, especially when 70%, 72% of the planet, we know very little. You know, we need to understand this if we want to do sustainable development and have a level of comfort that we're making good decisions, right? That we're not doing things that are going to have impact on things we don't even know exist, right? Super important on a characterization basis to understand what's out there. And yet, if you talk about ethics and thinking about, well, what does that do and in whose hands? And well, when people find out that they're there, and you have the people who want the last thing on the planet, or which relates to even how we utilize data now to where it becomes available more and more. How do you protect any of that? And coming from a community whose, you know, indigenous or intellectual property has been utilized and misutilized a lot, you start thinking about those ethical kind of, you know, and also if there's a monetary component to it, because you can monetize some of this stuff, who benefits? How do you talk about benefit sharing and all of that? So all of that gets, you just want to do this cool thing, find out what was in the ocean, help save it, right? And then you're like, wow, there's all this stuff that we really have to think about. But that's when we get into, we need everybody in this. We need the data, the legal people. We need the people who are thinking about philosophy and ethics. We need the biologists, and bringing us together to figure out, this is a collective thing that we have to decide. And how do we put equity and social justice right there in the very beginning when we're talking about, you know, pairing up the last female and male of something, right? It all comes together, and that's part of making sure that we put ourselves back in nature. We've somehow forgotten that we think we're like not part of nature. We behave like we're not part of nature. And yet, again, lesson from climate, we're becoming very clear with ourselves again that we're absolutely kind of part of nature.
Andrea, did you want to touch on anything?
About technology, what I would like to see dreaming big. One day I would like to see, maybe here in Silicon Valley, a sort of fusion center, a sort of command and control center, every single bit of information about Earth, health, here. And it doesn't exist. And why doesn't it exist? You know, now information is scattered around a gazillion of NGOs, government, research centers, university people, journalists, anything. So why we cannot build this kind of deep place where you enter and you can ask, how is Earth today? How is environmental crime? How are the oceans? And this is my big dream, one day to see such a cluster of technologies and methodologies, of course with analysts and everything, all combined in a very powerful way at getting and crunching information from everywhere. We don't
have to measure all of it first.
Yeah.
Can't you do that?
Actu-
Will?
well,
First, you have to
Do that
collect.
already.
I'm so glad we
Get
got
on
on
with
this
that.
topic.
Will is ready to
You're like,
seat.
come
He's
on,
so
Will.
excited.
Just an
Going
idea for
for
you.
Very interesting. It's like you read this. I've written an op-ed on that very topic of what I call Earth Mission Control. I mean, at NASA, we had that like for every complex mission. You bring all the key data together, the decision makers make, and for war time, people have war rooms. Bring all
Exactly.
the data into one room, the decision makers. It's like, what the hell? Why don't we have that for climate, SDGs, whatever we call it, Earth Dashboard? Or something similar. Yeah, I do think that that's extremely compelling vision, and it's something that Silicon Valley has a lot of the wherewithal to bring to bear as how it can help positively, other than just fixing the challenges that it's bringing to the world. It could also, this is a more positive vision, and I think we need to get to those sort of hopeful things. And an Earth dashboard displaying how we're doing against all these things, how we can compare different countries against each SDG and so on. To make it, I also wanted to throw in, I mean, apart from, of course, that satellite data is the solution to answer that, is AI. This is a cross-cutting issue. I mean, it's of course, got tremendous ability to help us on almost all of these fronts. Just like it is affecting almost every technology and other discipline. But, you know, being able to understand all the, you know, we can do land use classification of all of our images, and this is a road, there's a building, there's a ship, there's a plane, there's a field with wheat, there's a field with corn, whatever. All of that stuff can be just pulled out automatically, and that enables you to just have alert systems to a set of citizen scientists around the world or activists. And so in principle, we have tremendous tools between these emerging data sets and AI to have a much more distributed system of actors.
Really quick, at the start of every year, I personally put together a business development plan. And part of that is identifying technology companies that have the ability to scale and also have true missions around environmental impact. And you know, there's a reason why we're having this panel, you know, because I think there's huge opportunity. I mean, you just see it in every image that Planet Labs captures. And you know, what gives me excitement is to see, you know, the rocket ship that Impossible Foods is on, the success that Planet is having. You know, Indigo Agriculture is a company that I think is doing amazing things as well. But there are great companies out there. There are great investment opportunities as well, potentially for SoftBank. I see some SoftBank people here, and Redpoint. Sorry, but all kidding aside, I do think that as more people start to lean forward and prioritize planet and people, there will be a natural spring of innovation. It involves all of us.
Right? I mean, all the leading
100%.
economists are like, you can't keep on zero valuing all those resources that are being pulled into the economy.
Right.
We've got to change that. And all these governments are going to push down regulations onto all these industries to have, you know, souped up versions of ESG goals. How can they meet those ESG goals if they don't have measurement systems?
Exactly.
It all pulls into the same. It's going to be pulled into the, you know, it's part of a changing economy.
Yeah.
I mean, we consider ourselves part of at least two major trends. One is the digitization of industries like insurance and finance and agriculture and transport, and another is all this ESG movement. And as the finance sector figures out that it has to take into account supply chains and sustainability along those things.
Can you explain really quickly ESG? I'm happy to, but ESG.
Well, this is just basically companies measuring their social impact, societal impact, and thinking about their governance and other things. But I mean, in this context, I mean all of the things like measuring your supply chains, understanding your ecological footprint, and understanding your effect in society. And I think those things have to be measured. I mean, and banks and regulatory authorities are starting to bring this stuff up. I mean, it's not, they're not messing around. They're like, you're going to have to start doing all these things. Well, the first thing companies are going to have to do is measure it.
Yeah. What I've been most excited about over the last year is seeing the funding that's going specifically into conservation organizations, number one, and also the momentum from a capital markets perspective in ESG. I mean, you have limited partners, whether they be pension funds or family offices, putting pressure on asset managers to allocate their dollars and cents into companies that don't have shoddy child labor laws or polluting, with their plants in communities. It's really great to see. Sebastian?
Yeah, we have another question from the online audience. This one comes from Hanan Masboob from Warren, Michigan. He's an environmental and GIS student at Johns Hopkins. He asked if technology can help implement conservation or preservation efforts in countries that have capacity challenges. He's interested particularly in Iraq and in places where there's conflict or other issues going on. How can technology help play a role to achieve conservation outcomes?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I would...
I'm glad I'm a moderator for that one.
I was going to say, one thing that, of course, immediately comes to mind is a lot of these conflicts are related to environmental challenges.
Yeah.
I mean, the Syria conflict started when there's a drought, and that led to failures of crops, and then you have a lot of young, restless males that don't know what to do, and this causes a lot of challenges for society. So they're not unrelated. In our user conference last month, we had this very senior ecologist right before a very senior government intelligence official, and people are like, "Why on earth have you got these two people on the stage?" And it's actually because they both got the same problem. If you have these ecological impacts, you have security issues, and vice versa. They're totally interrelated. So
yeah, really quickly, just because of time, we're going to go rapid fire with one question, one response. And I see someone in actually, Brandon, will go after the person behind you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you guys. This was really inspiring. My name's Tommy. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Network here in San Francisco. And my question is a bit about, I think it's incredible everything you guys are doing, but we don't want to just sit back and watch the world burn with this incredible technology. And sometimes I fear that Planet Labs is an incredible organization, but the true impact is on the ground with a person that's deciding whether or not to deforest to have livestock. And I wonder, how do we get this technology and this decision-making into the hands of people on the ground in a better way? Because those are the true people that are making these decisions, and we can't just sit back and hope that they're going to make the right decisions, but it takes major infrastructure change to help them ultimately.
yeah.
I would love to chime in, but it's kind of directed at you.
I don't know.
So I was just going to say that, that's a very strong argument, one that I would partially agree with. And my answer is that it is the responsibility of so many of these initiatives to have strong anti-poverty efforts, right? Because, Will identified that landscape change, right? Like land use change is what is causing so much of these problems, like climate change. And landscape change and land use change comes because there's some type of economic incentive to change the land from one state to another, especially in parts of the developing world. And anti-poverty efforts do tremendous things for the environment, not just people, right? We can see that at a local scale. We can see that in San Francisco. We can see it in the developing world. And so for every conservation organization to have a strong anti-poverty department, organization, group of critical thinkers, or to partner with other groups, right? Don't reinvent the wheel, but really support those groups that do anti-poverty work. We will see reductions in land use and landscape change. I'm saying this having worked in parts of Africa, but now working in rural Montana, where cattle ranchers are one missed paycheck away from being in poverty, and then destroy the land, destroy the soil in order to just hold on to a few more dollars. So it's completely widespread, but it is definitely a solution.
And just in terms of quick response to the point about Planet, and I mean, I think this is super important. I mean, and there's no point having the technology unless it really serves people on the ground. That's why, as a space geek, we're putting up all these satellites, but their goal is taking pictures of the ground. They're not pointed up. That's what I used to do at NASA. But turn my attention to this planet because it happens to be the most interesting, at least so far, that we've found. And what we do is we try and get that data into the hands of those NGOs that obviously, or commercial organizations to do that action on the ground. I mean, we can't be all things to all people. We're just a few hundred people, and we mainly spent that time and effort building all these satellites because it's really complicated just to get them up. But then we have thousands of academics that use the data and hundreds of NGOs that use the data, and we hope that they will use it for those purposes, and we try to ensure that they get a good rate on getting access to it, if not get it for free.
Sebastian, another question from the online audience?
Yeah, we have another question from Brian Mahan. He's asked that a lot of the technologies and examples discussed today mention big governments or big NGOs using the data from these new technologies. His question is, can emerging technologies also empower individual and community level action to lead to better conservation outcomes?
Andrea, Alani, I don't know if you...
It is a technology. So 5 years ago, we launched a project called Wild Leaks, which is the world's first whistleblowing initiative dedicated to environmental crime. It's based on a Tor technology, on a Tor platform, and it has been very successful. We are about to publish the first report in about a month. Basically, we built on Tor a safe space where to give the opportunity to everyone around the world to send us information confidentially, securely, and anonymously. And now we are in the process of applying the same concept, but to put it in a smartphone. We haven't done it yet because it's fairly easy to protect yourself behind the computer and be anonymous. It's not that easy using a smartphone, especially in certain countries. But that's an example of a fairly simple technology, or at least not a new technology. So the whole technology behind Tor that can be used locally by everyone to report, to send information to others. That's it. That's what we do.
We'll go. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Brandon, I promised you, and then maybe we'll finish with you, Arun.
Sure. My name is Brandon Southall. I've worked in marine science, marine bioacoustics for a long time, and I'm coming at the issue from having been in a bunch of different spaces. I came out of the academic and still in the academic space. I worked as a federal program manager in ocean science, started a small business that I still run that does a lot of work with energy companies. I've sort of dealt with the energy industry sector. And we just started this new nonprofit called California Ocean Alliance. So my question, and maybe this is directed at you, Will, because you you touched on a bunch of these transformational approaches to addressing big picture problems. And I think a lot of the things we see that are problems in the ocean and on land we're realizing they're multi-trophic, they're inherently ecologically linked, they require multidisciplinary, larger teams. The problem is from the academic space, we're all living on the grant cycle and working in this competitive type of environment. Many of the government programs, tend to have the sort of problems that governments have, and big NGOs and other bureaucracies have some of those problems too. So I guess my question is, how do you see this transformation to go to these bigger picture, interrelated, interdisciplinary, ecological problems focused around a couple of things when there are impediments to doing that with the tools and the kind of systems that we all typically work in?
Yeah, gosh, I think that's such a great question. We don't really have the systems in society or the entities to tackle the problems. We don't have world government to deal with transnational issues like climate, and we don't have even institutions that can help ensure species from land to ocean that are interconnected get conserved. So everything in between. And I don't suppose to have a solid answer, but one thing that comes to my mind is that when I look at the challenges and try to isolate it down to what the general and most important solution paths to the 80% of the problem, the kind of 3 areas that I mentioned, mostly it's federal governments, it's nation states, and the dominant controlling actors of whether or not you create a park, whether or not you put some more land to be no trees being taken out or what have you, and it down really the G20 has the vast majority of the marine areas in its exclusive economic zones, the vast majority of the area of the land, because it's got all the big countries in it. It's got the vast majority of the economic output, the power supplies. Even if you got those countries to agree to a certain, just to these 3 projects, in my mind, that's the sort of hopeful vision, back to your point, because I think we do have to be hopeful about this. And so I think it is incumbent on the nation states more than anything else. They control the farming practices because they control the regulations that back the insurance farmers that then, so it's things like the Farm Bill has to change in the US and equivalent things. And ultimately, the government plays a big role. It can't only be the onus of that. And I think that tech companies, for example, can do a lot. Private philanthropists can do a lot. Like planting trees is a good one for philanthropists, as far as I'm concerned, or buying up land that's in particular corridors for protection of biodiversity. But the governments probably have the biggest onus of responsibility, I would say.
Irvin?
Sure. Hi, Irvin Tu with SoftBank Vision Fund. I lead our sustainable investing practice, so actively looking for companies, technologies that are enhancing your day jobs. Thank you. This has been a privilege to listen to really fascinating perspectives. My question relates to Andrea and Will probably most specifically, which is, who are your customers? In Will's case, not the commercial ones. I know you have commercial customers, but who is asking you to investigate the gold mine in this National Reserve? Like, who are the customers, and what's causing them to seek these answers? Were they seeking answers? They were asking questions and they didn't have a solution, so they found you. You were solving a pain point, or are they now, because they're aware of who you are, asking more questions? Is it we take a ton more pictures now because we have cameras on our phones. Is that the phenomenon, or were they seeking answers already? They just found you. Who are your customers?
So, our first client is Earth, but it's not a joke. You have every morning you have to wake up within am I doing something in the interest of Earth or not? So that's the main client. Then we have sub-customers, let's say. And I would divide them in, one is the public, of course, because we are a public NGO. In our case, our main customers are government entities, so law enforcement agencies that receive information from us free of charge, no strings attached, backed up by analysts and all. It's not just one delivery. I can give you two examples, very quick. One very practical. 2 years ago in Thailand, they arrested 2 of the most important wildlife traffickers in Asia because of us. So we worked for 6 months, 8 months, and then in the meantime, we developed a relation with the Thai authorities, and then they did that. In other case, so it's very targeted. In other case, for example, right now we're working on illegal fishing in Baja California. It's too long here, but there's a whole issue going around with the illegal fish of a fish called totoaba. The swim bladder is wanted on the Chinese market. So in that case, we are producing tons of intelligence when we can, actionable intelligence that they can use immediately. And there is a continuous knowledge transfer from us to them. And they learn every time they meet. So in our case, our donor has to understand very well this process. Otherwise he thinks that we are wasting our time. But actually, every time we give information to any government entity, if they are receptive, there is a great opportunity for them to grow and one day to do things by themselves. So these are our customers.
Just very briefly, we believe that most of our for-profit side, firstly, is doing impact too. I mean, if we make agriculture is our largest sector, if we help that make that more efficient, then we don't have to take down more forests to feed the planet. Great. But in a more specific sense, sometimes law enforcement agencies, also like the Brazil government, that's the federal police that we're working with there on stopping illegal deforestation, as an example. And the Peruvian mine, it was the Peruvian government gold mine, although it was press that initially found it. It asked for it. Based on they were doing some investigative journalism. We do work a lot with journalists who expose things, like we've been involved with the Uyghur camps in China, through to and discoveries there to the everything to do with missile facilities being detected and detention centers or refugee camps or things like that. A lot of that comes from our data now, and those are investigative journalists going in who we give access to our data. And then NGOs, of course, things like the Vulcan Institute that's trying to do conservation work and realizing the value of our data to do that.
One thing that I really like about this conversation, sorry to
No.
elongate the answer, is when you think about designing for nature, bringing that business acumen into nature, as I was mentioning before, I think an expansion, and what I am hearing from this is you have customers, those are those payers, but you have consumers who may or may not pay, and you have beneficiaries. And sometimes you may start with the beneficiaries and end up with a customer. Sometimes you start with a customer and find out you have 10 more because the data that you're using. And this kind of expansion of a conversation is different. And I've seen this evolve, and I'm really excited. This is one of these hope areas for me, is that these conversations are becoming more kind of evolved or nuanced, and that we're talking a lot more about incentives and incentive structures, which relate to the question before, is how do we incentivize on a policy level, on a business level, but that really trying to come up with a common language about customers, consumers, and beneficiaries,
That's why I'm asking the question,
I think is important.
I come from a commercial standpoint, obviously, and how do you enhance the demand, the customer demand, for what you're providing? You clearly created a compelling offering, each of you, and how do you enhance the customer demand for that offering? It's good.
A lot of it's awareness.
Yeah.
For example, I cannot mention by name, but there is one federal agency in the U.S. who contact us, and they say, "Can you do a little bit more on that?"
Right.
That's the first time that federal agency actually asked us for something, and our answer was, "I'm sorry, I cannot. If I don't have a donor who also wants to do that, I cannot do it." Because you don't pay for millions of reasons. They cannot pay you to do that, the federal agency. So there's a triangle that I have to have all three. Exactly.
We wanted to hold this to an hour and a half. I'm wondering if being respectful of all of your time, if we might just stop right now, unless somebody has a burning desire to ask a final question. And I will just say, for the folks online, any questions that we didn't get to, we're going to do our best to try to get them answered by Heidrick and Struggles or our panelists. This is a grassroots effort, and we're learning as we're doing this. So the next time we'll probably do more of a Q&A, less regurgitation on people's bios, especially after Aulani's "please stop" motion. But
Where was that even from?
But a couple things. I just want to thank everyone for joining in the room and online, and maybe we can just applaud the folks that have joined. I also want to thank a couple people at Johns Hopkins, Dr. Jen DeRosa, who's been an internal champion and partner and advisor for us as we've gone through. As we've gone through the process of launching this speaker series. Dr. Jerry Burgess, whose passion around the issues we're exploring motivates his students, me being one of them. And I wish I had the words actually to describe, Jerry, how inspirational you are for our student body. He's been an advocate for us getting this panel off the ground, and he's point blank one of the best professors I've ever had. Dr. Diana Watts has been an incredible mentor to us and giving of her time. Tasha Overpeck and the marketing team at Johns Hopkins, they've worked late into the evenings. The promotional images that you've seen all came from Tasha and her team. And also Dean Donahue, of course, we could not do this without your support, and we thank you so much. At Heidrick, and maybe we can invite these people to come up with us, Katie DeHaas and Kristen Munoz. This would not be possible without the two of you. Also, Brad Warga. Is Brad still here, or did he take off? Brad Warga, Todd Taylor, Jenny Hibbert, John Tom, Josh Ainsfield, and the Heidrick marketing team. Mary Martle, and Jake Allen. Where are you? Jake, you can, and Mary, come on up if we're calling your name. I also want to thank Ryan Rollins and his incredible production team at ICV Digital Media. If you're looking for help with a webcast, Ryan's in the back with his hand up. Also wanted to thank Sebastian Nichols for leading our Q&A. Anna Blanco, where is Anna? Anna and Marion Pond for being our greeters. And also, Marion, thank you for sharing your family story with us at the beginning. I really appreciate that. A quick plug for the International Ocean Film Festival, where Sebastian and Anna are coming. The film festival is March 12th through the 15th, is that right? And we'll be here in San Francisco. And finally, and maybe most importantly, we should give a big round of applause for our panelists, Andrea, Ray, Will, and Alana. Thank you so much. I hope you all can join us next time where we're going to be exploring environmentalism in apparel. Clothing, apparel is the third highest polluting industry in the world, and 3/5 of all clothing items are going to end up in the incinerator or landfills within a year after being produced. Crazy. This panel is going to be tackling the challenges of being successful in a consumer goods industry where selling less might be the best way to make an impact. Panelists will discuss how they are creating paradigm changes by educating and selling concepts of owning fewer but better items, popularizing new fibers and recycling. And then really quickly, we want to dedicate this panel specifically to Alani, if you're comfortable saying her name. And
It's so kind. To Sue Tae. She is a colleague and a longtime marine ocean conservation advocate, particularly for Pacific peoples and for the Pacific. She had a long fight with cancer and she passed away 3 days ago. So thanks, Scott, for thinking to dedicate this to Sue Tae and the many seeds she planted, and we're all dedicated to keeping it going.
Conserving and regenerating our environment is going to necessitate intergenerational leadership. And again, that's the currency that we trade on at Heidrick & Struggles. And it needs to happen now, and it needs to happen with this generation. And so I'm excited. I am hopeful, and I am very thankful again for everybody online and everybody in this room and our panelists for joining. And we'll see you again soon. Thank you.